The grand throne room of the verdant spire shimmered with the soft green glow of bioluminescent vines that twisted up the marble pillars like living serpents. Sunlight filtered through crystalline domes overhead, casting fractal patterns across the polished jade floor. At the center of it all sat Queen Virilia, tall, regal, with skin the deep green of ancient forests and hair like spun moonlight cascading past her shoulders. Her eyes large and luminous with pupils shaped like vertical slits, narrowed in fury as she rose from her throne, the folds of her emerald robe swirling like storm clouds. Before her, standing at rigid attention despite the heat of her glare, was Turin, a human man in a simple palace guard uniform, his boots scuffed from patrol, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression caught somewhere between panic and bewilderment. Around them, quarters froze mid-whisper, their green skin paling with alarm, their white hair trembling as though caught in an invisible wind. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on, shattered only by the Queen's voice, low at first, then rising like thunder across the plains of Zara. "Why?" Queen Virilia growled, her voice vibrating through the very bones of the chamber. "Does my daughter call you father human?" Turin blinked. He wanted to laugh. It was absurd, ridiculous. But the look in the Queen's eyes told him laughter would be the last sound he ever made. He swallowed hard. "Your Majesty," he began, voice steadier than he felt. "I have no idea." From a side archway, a small figure darted into the room, barefoot clad in a tunic 2 sizes too big. Her green skin dotted with freckles, her white hair tied in messy braids that bounced with every step. The child, Princess Lai, skidded to a halt beside Turin and wrapped herself around his leg like a vine. She tilted her face up at her mother, eyes wide and unafraid. "Because he is my father," she declared, as if stating the sky was blue or that the twin moons rose at dusk. "He makes soup when I have nightmares. He showed me how to tie knots. He saved Tizzy from the ventilation shaft." Tizzy, a small 6-legged creature with iridescent fur, poked its head from Lee's pocket and chirped in agreement. Queen Virilia's jaw tightened, her fingers curled into fists, the delicate rings on her fingers glinting like warning flares. "He is a human, a hired blade assigned to palace security after the Third Accord. He is not your father," Leary scowled. "Then who is?" The portrait in the Hall of Echoes doesn't hug back. That struck like a blade between the ribs. The Queen flinched, her composure cracking for just a heartbeat. Turin saw it, the flicker of pain beneath the regal mask, and something in his chest twisted. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself back on Earth. When the recruiters came to take him after his own parents vanished in the Martian dust storms, he'd been 8. No one had hugged him for years after that. "I didn't. I never told her to call me that," Turin said quietly, his voice rough with sincerity. "I just stayed. When she asked me to. That's all." The Queen's eyes locked onto him, searching for deceit, for ambition, for the scheming of a foreigner seeking royal favor through a child's innocent trust. But all she found was exhaustion and kindness, deep and unguarded. It unsettled her more than defiance would have. The truth was, Turin hadn't planned any of this. 8 months ago, he'd been a grunt in the Earth Coalition's peacekeeping division, stationed on Zara after the war that nearly shattered the alliance between humans and the verdant people of the Zari Dominion. Assigned to the royal palace as part of the post-war trust-building initiative, he'd expected boredom, protocol, and maybe a few ceremonial parades. Instead, he'd found Lyri alone in the palace gardens at midnight, talking to fireflies, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She'd looked up at him with those huge eyes and asked, "Are you going to leave, too?" He hadn't known what to say, so he'd sat beside her in the grass. And when she fell asleep against his shoulder, he carried her back to her chambers, walking past startled attendants, ignoring the protocol that forbade humans from entering royal quarters without escort. He'd done it again the next night and the next until it became routine, until Lyri started waiting for him after evening drills, tugging at his sleeve, asking him to show her Earth constellations or teach her silly human songs that sound like birds. He never thought of himself as a father. He thought of himself as someone who wouldn't walk away. But children don't need titles to know love when they see it. The court buzzed now, whispers flitting like moths. "Scandal," someone muttered. "A human influencing the air." Another gasped. One nobleman, Lord Siverin, stepped forward, his green skin streaked with silver ceremonial markings. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly, "this is a breach of cosmic order. The bloodline must remain pure. The child's affections must be redirected." "My daughter's affections," Virilia interrupted coldly. Are you concerned, Lord Siverin? But the doubt had taken root. She turned back to Turin, her voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. Explain from the beginning. So he did. He told them how he'd first met Lyrie during the Festival of Falling Petals, when she'd climbed onto the palace ramparts to watch the sky blossoms detach and spiral downward like emerald snow. How she'd slipped and he'd caught her mid-fall. His reflexes honed by years of combat, saving a life that wasn't his to protect. How she'd laughed in his arms, breathless and delighted, and called him Skycatcher. How she'd started leaving drawings under his bunk. Crude sketches of him with too many arms labelled Turin Strong in wobbly Zari script. He told them how weeks later she'd crept into the guard barracks during a power outage, shivering in the dark, whispering that the shadows were whispering back. He'd let her sleep on his cot wrapped in his spare blanket while he stood watch by the door how she'd woken up and asked, "Do human dads let their kids sleep in their rooms?" And when he'd said, "Sometimes," she'd frowned and said, "Then why aren't you my dad?" He hadn't answered. He just tucked the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The court listened in stunned silence. Even Lord Siverin looked less certain, but Queen Verilia's face remained unreadable. A mask of jade and sorrow. "You overstepped," she said finally. "You entered spaces forbidden to outsiders. You formed bonds without permission. You allowed my child to believe this." She gestured sharply at Lyrie, still clinging to Turin's leg. "I didn't allow anything," Turin said, and for the first time, his voice carried steel. "I just didn't say no when she needed someone. Isn't that what parents do?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lyrie looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You are my Dad," she whispered. Even if Mom won't say it, Queen Varilia closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She looked not like a ruler of worlds, but like a woman drowning in grief too heavy to name. When she opened them again, her gaze was fixed on the far wall, on the portrait of her late consort, Prince Callan, whose smile had faded into the canvas years ago. He died during the war, not in battle, but in a shuttle accident while returning from peace talks with the human delegation. Lyrie had been 3. She barely remembered him. "You speak of bonds," Varilia said softly, "as if they are simple things, but bonds carry weight. They shape destiny. And destiny, human, is not kind to those who meddle with royal blood." "I'm not meddling," Turin said. "I'm just here." Before she could respond, alarms blared through the palace. Deep resonant chimes that vibrated in the chest. Red emergency lights pulsed along the ceiling vines. A guard burst into the throne room. Breathless, "Your Majesty, raiders. From the ashen wastes, they've breached the outer gate. They're heading for the spire." Chaos erupted. Courtiers scattered. Weapons materialized from hidden panels in robes. Turin instinctively moved in front of Lyrie, his body shielding hers without thought. Queen Verilia's expression hardened into battle readiness. Her grief was replaced by command. "Secure the child," she ordered a nearby guard.
"No, Lyrie Craid, clashing torrentaiter."
"He stays with me." Varilia hesitated only a second. But it was enough. The raiders were no ordinary bandits. They were remnants of the Crimson Fong, a splinter faction that rejected the peace accords. Fanatics who believed the Zari bloodline must be cleansed of foreign influence. And they knew the palace's weaknesses better than anyone. More guards rushed in, but it was too late. A section of the eastern wall exploded inward in a shower of jade and fire. Smoke filled the chamber. Through the haze, figures emerged, tall, scarred, their green skin painted with ash, their white hair bound in warrior knots. Their leader, a hulking brute with a cybernetic eye that glowed red, stepped forward, a plasma axe humming in his grip. "Queen Varilia," he sneered. "Time to cut the tainted branch." His eyes locked onto Lyrie. Turin didn't think. He moved. He shoved Lyrie behind him, drawing the short pulse blade at his hip. An outdated Earth model, barely regulated, but familiar in his hand. The raider laughed. "A human. You think this soft thing can stop us?" Turin said nothing. He lunged. What followed was a blur of motion and violence. Turin wasn't the strongest, but he was fast. Trained in close-quarters combat in the Martian Dust Wars. He ducked under the plasma axe's swing, slashed at the raider's knee joint, and rolled as another attacker charged. He used the throne room's pillars for cover, drawing fire away from the Queen and Lyrie. Around him, Zari guards fought bravely, but the raiders were prepared. They disabled communications, sabotaged the palace's defense grid. Queen Varelia fought like a storm made flesh, her energy whip crackling through the air, severing limbs with terrifying grace. But she was outnumbered, and the raiders kept coming. Larry, wide-eyed but not screaming, pressed herself against a pillar, watching Turin weave through blades and fire when a raider spotted her and charged. She didn't run. She picked up a fallen ceremonial dagger too big for her hand and held it out trembling but defiant. "Don't you touch my dad," she shouted. The raider chuckled, reaching for her. Turin saw it from across the room. Time seemed to slow. He threw his pulse blade like a knife. It spun end over end and buried itself in the raider's shoulder. The alien howled, stumbling. Turin sprinted, leaping over fallen bodies, and tackled the raider to the ground. He didn't stop to fight. He grabbed Lyri's hand and yanked her toward a hidden service corridor he'd memorized during his patrols. "Go!" He yelled at the queen over the den. "Secure the vault. I'll get her to safety." Varelia met his eyes across the battlefield. In that moment, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. He wasn't a threat. He was a shield. She nodded once. "The Azure Garden." She shouted back. "There's a bunker beneath the moon willow." Turin didn't hesitate. He scooped Lyri into his arms. She was light, all bone and will, and ran. Behind them, the throne room became a maelstrom of fire and fury. But ahead lay twisting corridors, dimly lit, deserted. Lyri buried her face in his neck, her small hands gripping his uniform. "I knew you'd save me," she whispered. "Always," he said, and meant it. They reached the Azure Garden, a secluded courtyard filled with luminous blue flora that glowed like drowned stars. The moon willow stood at its center, its silver leaves shimmering in the emergency lights. Turin found the hidden hatch beneath its roots, pried it open, and ushered Lyri inside. The bunker was small, stocked with rations, water, and a comms unit. "Stay here," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. "No matter what you hear, promise me." Lyri bit her lip, then nodded. "You're coming back, right?" He hesitated. He didn't know, but he couldn't tell her that. "Yeah," he said, ruffling her hair. "I'll be back before you finish your snack." He sealed the hatch and turned back toward the chaos. The palace was burning. Smoke choked the halls. The raiders had set fire to the archives, the library, the Hall of Echoes. Turin moved like a ghost, avoiding patrols, using his knowledge of the layout to flank enemy positions. He found a fallen guard's rifle, Zariatech, unfamiliar but functional, and used it to pick off stragglers from the shadows. Then he heard voices near the royal vault. Peering around a corner, he saw Queen Varelia backed against the vault door, her energy whipped, her robes torn. The Crimson Fong leader stood before her, his plasma axe raised. "You cling to power like a child to a blanket." The raider taunted. "But your child is already lost, tainted by human weakness. She's stronger than you will ever be." Varelia spat. The axe began its descent. Turin didn't aim. He fired from the hip. The plasma bolt struck the raider in the chest, blowing him backward in a spray of green blood. Varelia turned, stunned, as Turin emerged from the smoke, rifle smoking in his hands. "You came back," she said breathlessly. "Had to," he said, reloading. "My kid's is waiting." The word hung between them. "My kid, not the princess, not your daughter, my kid." And this time, Queen Varelia didn't correct him. Instead, she picked up her fallen whip, recharged it with a crystal from her belt, and stood beside him. "They've taken the East Wing," she said. "We need to rally the inner guard," he nodded. "Then let's go." Side by side, human and queen, they fought their way through the smoldering palace, were contained. The palace stood scarred but unbroken. In the quiet that followed, Turin returned to the Azure Garden and opened the bunker hatch. Lyri rushed out, throwing her arms around him. "You came back," she cried, tears streaking her green cheeks. "Told you I would," he said, hugging her tight. Queen Varelia stood a few paces away, watching them. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, clear as throat, were soft. Later that night, in the partially restored throne room, she summoned Turin. "You saved my daughter," she said, her voice quiet. "Not once, but twice." "I'd do it 1,000 times," he replied. She studied him for a long moment. "On Zara, we do not give titles lightly. Father, mother, These are not roles assumed. They are earned through sacrifice, through presence, through love that does not ask for reward. She paused. Leary has called no one father since Callan died. Not tutors, not uncles, not even the High Council regents who tried to guide her. Turin said nothing, his heart hammered in his chest. You did not seek this, Varelia continued. You did not scheme. You simply stayed. She stepped closer. And in staying, you became what she needed. She reached into the folds of a robe and withdrew a small pendant, a moon willow leaf carved from star crystal. This belonged to Callan. It is given only to those who are family. She held it out. Turin stared at it, stunned. I'm just a guard. You are Lyri's father, Varelia said, and for the first time, there was no question in her voice, only truth. He took the pendant. It was warm in his palm, humming faintly with energy. Outside, the twin moons rose over the verdant spire, casting silver light across the scarred but standing palace. Inside, a human man stood taller than he ever had. Not because of a title, but because he had finally been seen. Not as an outsider, not as a soldier, but as a father. And somewhere in the healing halls, a little girl with green skin and white braids was already planning tomorrow's lessons. Not tying earth songs and how to make the best soup for nightmares. Because now she had someone to teach. But as dawn approached, a new alert flickered on the palace's main display. A signal from the outer rim. Unknown ships, human design. Torrin's blood ran cold. He knew that signature. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the jagged peaks of the obsidian ranges when the alert pulsed again. Louder this time, insistent red glyphs flaring across every display screen in the verdant spire. Torrin stood frozen in the royal observation chamber, the star crystal pendant still warm against his chest, his eyes locked on the tactical map that now showed 7 human warships decelerating from FTL just beyond Zara's orbital defense perimeter. They weren't broadcasting identification codes. No diplomatic hails, just silent, ominous presence like wolves circling a wounded den. Queen Varelia entered behind him, her step silent on the moss-carved floor. She changed into her war robes, deep green layered with armored scales forged from meteoric iron, and her white hair was braided tightly down her back, threaded with mourning beads. She didn't need to ask what the display meant. Her people had fought humans before. They remembered the orbital bombardments, the poisoned rivers, the years of mistrust. But now she looked at Turin, not as a soldier of that past, but as the man who'd held her daughter through nightmares. Your fleet? She asked, voice low. Turin shook his head slowly. Not mine. Not anymore. He turned to her, jaw tight. The coalition disbanded my unit after the peace accords. They called us too soft for working with Zari. Most of us were reassigned or retired. He paused, eyes narrowing at the ship's formation. That's Blackthorn commanding hardliners. They never accepted the treaty. Varelia's fingers curled around the hilt of her energy whip. Why are they here? Before he could answer, the palace calms crackled to life. A voice cold clipped human filled the chamber. Zari Dominion, this is Admiral Corin of the Earth Coalition Defense Fleet. We are here to retrieve a war criminal hiding within your palace walls. Surrender Turin Veric immediately, or we will consider your entire world in violation of the Interstellar Non-Harborance Accord. Turin's blood turned to ice. We're criminals. Varelia's eyes snapped to him, sharp with alarm, but not disbelief. What did they accuse you of? I don't know, he said, voice hollow. I never have. Then it hit him. 18 months ago, the Battle of Syra 7, a coalition strike went wrong. Civilians caught in crossfire. Turin had been the only one to report the truth. That Blackthorn command had ignored evacuation warnings. That innocent Zari colonists had died not by accident, but by order. He'd filed the report. It vanished. Days later, his unit was dissolved. He was quietly shipped off to Zara as a cultural liaison. He thought it was an exile. Now he realized it was silencing. And now they were rewriting history, making him the scapegoat. They're lying, he said, turning to Varelia. They're trying to cover up their own war crimes by painting me as the monster. She studied his face. The raw shock, the betrayal, the dawning horror. She'd seen lies before. She knew the truth when it stood bleeding in front of her. Lyri believes in you, she said simply. That is enough for me. But outside, the human fleet powered up their main cannons. Zari defense satellites whirred into position. green energy fields humming to life around the planet. War loomed again, this time, not between nations, but between truth and lies. Then Leary burst into the chamber, breathless. Tizzy clutched in her arms. Mom, Turin, the ships, they're from your world. She ran to Turin, eyes wide with fear. Are they taking you away? He knelt, placing his hands on her shoulders. No one's taking me anywhere, he said firmly. Not without a fight. But even as he said it, a new transmission cut through the tension, not from the human fleet, but from deep within Zara's own crust. A voice, ancient and resonant, echoed through the palace's biotic network. The stone heart has awakened. Varelia went pale.
Impossible.
Turin frowned. What's the stone heart? A myth, she whispered. An ancient Zari weapon buried beneath the planet's core. Built during the first Star Wars. Said to be able to fold space to erase entire fleets from existence. But it was sealed millennia ago, disabled, its key lost. Leary tugged at Turin's sleeve. The key is the Moon Willow pendant. Isn't it? She said softly. Both adults turned to her. What? Turin asked. Leary pointed to the star crystal leaf now glowing faintly against his chest. Grandma's journal said, So, I read it last week. The key isn't metal or code. It's love. The pendant only works if the bearer is bound to Zara by heart, not blood. She looked up at him, eyes shining. That's why Mom gave it to you. Groan reverberated through the foundations. The walls pulsed with green light. Vines uncoiled like waking serpents. The entire spire was responding to him. Outside, Admiral Corrin's voice returned. Sharper now. Final warning. Surrender Turin Verk or we open fire in 60 seconds. Varelia grabbed Turin's hand. There's a chamber beneath the spire, the heart-root nexus. Only someone holding the pendant can activate the stone heart. But be warned. Once awakened, it must be controlled or it will consume the planet. Turin looked at Leary. Will you be safe here? She nodded fiercely. I'll guard Mom. He didn't have time to argue. With the pendant blazing in his grip, he sprinted through secret passages only of the royal family. And now he was meant to know. The walls guided him, roots shifting to clear his path. The very architecture is alive with ancient purpose. He reached the nexus, a cavernous chamber at the planet's geothermal core, where a massive crystalline heart pulsed with slow-rhythmed light. It thrummed like a sleeping god. As he stepped forward, the pendant fused with his palm, painless, but profound. Knowledge flooded him. How to channel the stone heart, how to fold space, how to shield Zara without destroying the human fleet. Or maybe with destroying them. The choice was his. Above the countdown reached 10 seconds. Turin closed his eyes. He thought of Lee's laughter, of Varelia's quiet strength, of the soup he made with too much salt that she pretended to love. He thought of Earth, not the corrupt admirals, but the quiet hills where he played as a boy, the stars that looked the same from every world. He chose mercy. He didn't fire the stone heart as a weapon. He used it as a mirror. With a surge of will, he projected an exact, undeniable replay of the Syrah 7 massacre. Every order, every transmission, every lie, directly into the minds of every human aboard the fleet, not as data, as experience. They felt the Zari mother's terror as her children burned. They heard the screams. They knew the truth. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Corrin staggered back, hands clawing at his temples, tears streaming down his face. No, we didn't. I didn't. But the truth was undeniable. The fleet powered down. Weapons offline. Hails switched to open frequency. Zori Dominion. This is Admiral Corrin. We see now we surrender our command. Request asylum and trial. Silence. Then from the palace, Queen Varelia's voice was clear and commanding. You will face justice, not ours. Yours. Let your own people judge what you've done. Turin slumped against the stone heart. Drained but alive. The pendant attached, cool now, resting in his palm like a promise kept. When he returned to the surface, dawn had broken in full. The sky was clear. The fleet hung motionless, no longer a threat, but a question. Leary ran to him, leaping into his arms. You did it, Dad. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of moon blossoms and child sweat. We did it. Varelia approached, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder. You could have destroyed them, she said quietly. But you showed them the truth instead. Truth is the only weapon that heals, he replied. She nodded slowly, then before the court, before the watching world. She did something no Zari queen had ever done. She knelt, not in submission, but in gratitude, and pressed her forehead to his. The gesture rippled through the gathered crowd. One by one, nobles, guards, even Lord Siverin, followed suit. Not to a human, to a father. In the weeks that followed, the palace became a bridge. Humans and Zari worked together to rebuild trust. Corrin and his officers stood trial on Earth broadcast galaxy-wide. Turin testified not for vengeance, but for memory, and in the heart of the verdant spire, a new tradition began. Every evening after drills, Turin would sit beneath the moon willow with Lyri, teaching her Earth constellations while Varelia watched from the balcony. A small smile playing on her lips. But peace, like love, is never static. One evening, as Turin pointed out Orion's belt, Lyri tugged his sleeve again. "Dad, what if I told you I found something else in Grandma's journal?" He raised an eyebrow. "Oh." She pulled out a small folded page, aged, covered in cryptic glyphs. It says, "The stone heart isn't just a weapon. It's a door, and it only opens when a human and a Zari speak the same truth at the same time." Turin exchanged a glance with Varelia, who had silently joined them. "What truth?" he asked. Lyri looked between them, her green eyes glowing with mischief and something deeper. "Hope. The truth about why the war really started." Varelia went still. "That's impossible. The war began over resource rights." Lyri shook her head. "Grandma wrote, it began because someone stole something precious from Earth, from us, and they never gave it back." Turin's mind raced. He'd never heard this version. Varelia's face padded further. "The Hearthstone core, the original one taken during the first contact riots. We thought it was lost." Lyri grinned. "It's not lost. It's hidden. And the journal says, only a father and a queen together can find it." Turin looked at Varelia. She looked back at him. No words passed between them. None were needed because they both knew the real story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The search for the stolen Hearthstone core began not with warships or weapons, but with quiet steps through forgotten archives, hushed conversations with elders, and late-night deciphering of glyphs that shimmered only under twin moons. Turin, Varelia, and Lyri became an unlikely trio, human, queen, and child. Bound not by blood, but by something far more enduring, trust. The journal led them beyond the palace, into the desert canyons, where the wind sang secrets older than stars, to ruins half swallowed by sand and time. There, beneath an ancient observatory aligned with Earth's North Star, a strange, deliberate echo across galaxies. They found it. The Hearthstone core pulsed softly in a sealed chamber, not as a weapon, but as a seed, smaller than Turin's fist. It glowed with a gentle blue light, humming a frequency that resonated in his bones and made Lee's white hair float as if underwater. Varelia gasped when she saw it. "It's alive," she whispered. "It's been waiting." According to the journal, the core wasn't stolen in anger. It was hidden by Zari and human scientists together during the chaos of first contact, when fear had turned neighbors into enemies. They'd buried it to protect it from those who would weaponize its power, hoping one day peace would be strong enough to bring it home. And now that day had come. Back at the Verdant Spire, Turin and Varelia stood together in the heart-root nexus, the original stone heart above them, the recovered core below. Lyri stood between them, holding both their hands. As the twin moons aligned overhead, they spoke the truth in unison. "Not as human and alien, return what was lost," they said. The moment the words left their lips, the two stones flared, one green, one blue, and merged into a single radiant orb that rose into the sky like a newborn star. From it, waves of energy spread, not as destruction, but as healing. Rivers once poisoned by war began to run clear. Withered forests sprouted new leaves. Across the galaxy, fractured colonies reported sudden, inexplicable surges of empathy, of understanding between species who had once only known suspicion. The Hearthstone wasn't a weapon. It was a bridge, and they had rebuilt it. In the months that followed, the Earth Coalition reformed, not as an army, but as a council of worlds. Turin was offered command of a new diplomatic fleet, but he declined. "My post is here," he told the emissaries, glancing toward the palace gardens, where Lyri was teaching Tizzy how to juggle fruit. They laughed as juice splattered across the grass, and Varelia, watching from a sunlit balcony, shook her head with a smile. The royal court no longer whispered about the human guard. They spoke of Lord Turin, father of the heir, not because of decree, but because it was simply true. He never wore a crown or carried a scepter. His authority came from the way Lyrie ran to him after lessons, from the quiet way Varelia sought his counsel before making decisions, from the fact that he still made soup, now with just the right amount of salt. One evening, as fireflies drifted through the azure garden, Lyrie curled up beside him on a stone bench. "Do you miss Earth?" she asked softly. Turin looked up at the stars. Some familiar, some new. "I used to," he admitted. "But home isn't a planet, Lyrie. It's the people who wait for you at the end of the day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Good, because I'm not letting you go." Varelia joined them then, her robes brushing the moon blossoms. She didn't sit, but stood behind them, one hand resting gently on Turin's shoulder, the other on Lee's hair. No words passed between them. None were needed. The silence was full enough, rich with all they'd survived, all they'd built, all they'd become. And high above, the Hearthstone core orbited peacefully, no longer hidden, no longer feared. It pulsed like a heartbeat shared between worlds, a reminder that even in the vast cold of space, kindness could take root, compassion could bloom, and love, unexpected, unasked for, unwavering,